All right, so we're going to start this week off by going over the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. You might have heard of them before, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail than you might have ever talked about before in class. So before we get started, okay, so the agenda, make sure, first of all, you do your attendance form. Then you're going to do the Edpuzzle that you're on right now for the carbon and nitrogen cycles. Then you'll do your interactive journal, section 1. And then your exit ticket at the very end. Keep in mind that if you have yet to do your quiz, grade progress reports are pulled on Tuesday morning. So your quiz is mandatory no matter if you just got into the class or if you've been in here for a while. All right, so for the do now, list 3 words that you associate with hearing the term carbon cycle. It could be any word. Your learning objective is students will be able to explain the importance of nitrogen and carbon cycles and what happens to the ecosystem if they are disrupted, right? Disrupted means that they're messed up, they don't continue a cycle, they're broken even if it's that severe. So first off, carbon. Let's talk about the carbon cycle. Carbon is the building block of the molecules of life. So we talk about bio, which means we're talking about carbon, okay? Proteins, sugars, it's in your DNA, it's in anything that has to do with life has carbon, okay? Molecules that have carbon are called organic molecules. And here we're not talking about like produce, like when you go buy vegetables at the store. It's not about that kind of organic. Organic means life, okay? In science, it just means life. Carbon is found in the air and oceans as carbon dioxide. So when it's a gas form, the most common form that we encounter is carbon dioxide. And it's called carbon dioxide because there's 1 carbon and then there's 2 oxygens. That's what this little 2 at the bottom means, dioxide. Di in science as a prefix, di and bi both mean 2. Okay, so carbon dioxide examples are like when you drive a car and there's gas emissions from the tailpipe, right? And then like when you breathe out, that's also carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is everywhere. So the process of removing carbon from air. CO2, or carbon dioxide, is taken out of the air by autotrophs or plants. And that's the only process that occurs naturally that actually pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So it's super important. Why do you think we keep talking about needing to plant trees and like compensating for deforestation by making sure we make sure that there's more trees planted, or we're donating to get more trees planted because trees are getting cut down for farmland and stuff, or they're like forest fires. We got to plant trees that got burned down so that we can make sure that we're not losing trees. So the process of photosynthesis is how they pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And this is the equation. You don't have to know it yet. We'll actually do a whole unit on it specifically. And as you can see, the most common number is 6. So it can take 6 whole molecules of carbon dioxide out of the air at one time, and it turns it into sugar, which is an energy source that is storable in plants. In the picture, you can see that it requires light energy from the sun, right? We talked about energy and food webs coming from the sun. And then carbon dioxide gets pulled in through the leaves. There's little holes in the leaves that the air can go into, and the air contains a lot of carbon dioxide. And then inside of the plants, in the green parts of the plants, they make sugar from the carbon dioxide and water pulled up from the roots, and then they can store it. And as a byproduct, they make oxygen. And no, they're not making oxygen on purpose. They're not making it in order to keep animals alive. They're not making it in order to keep other plants alive. They don't care. They just make it because that's just what happens when you break down carbon dioxide and make it into a sugar. Okay, we're just lucky that they make oxygen so that we can breathe it. It's the only reason that animals are able to live on Earth. Carbon in animals. So heterotrophs, like animals, don't do photosynthesis. Obviously, we're not green. We don't stand in the sun to get energy. If we could, it'd be a lot easier to live, but it's not how it is, right? So they get their carbon from the plants and other animals they eat. So if a plant is eaten by an animal, then that animal got that energy. And then if you don't eat a plant, but you eat an animal that ate a plant, then you're also getting that energy indirectly. Remember that it only goes up 10% at a time, right? We talked about that in the energy pyramids. So if like a plant has 100%, then the horse that eats it, sorry, not horse, let's talk about cows because we eat cows. And the cow that eats it only gets 10%. And then if you eat like a steak, like from a cow, then you only get 1% of that energy, right? All organisms use carbon for energy and growth. So plants use it more directly than we do because they actually source it, and then we consume things to get carbon so that we can grow, both physically bigger and to build more complex molecules. Like you have to replace cells, right? They die, so you have to make new ones. You require carbon for that in order to even just maintain your body. Adding carbon to air. Both plants and animals release CO2 into the air through cellular respiration. So you know that we and animals do it because we breathe out, right? We breathe in the oxygen and then our body breaks it down, uses it, and then puts it back out as carbon dioxide. Little did you know, plants also breathe. So they make oxygen, but they also use oxygen, okay? So don't ever make the mistake of thinking, oh, plants just make oxygen because that's all they're good for and that's all they do. No, they make oxygen because they need it too. And so because they're using oxygen, they're also producing carbon dioxide. They just happen to use up more carbon dioxide and produce more oxygen than they produce carbon dioxide. So that's how there's extra oxygen for us to breathe. But they still breathe out a little bit of carbon dioxide. So the equation for cellular respiration is this one. And again, we'll go into detail in another unit where we actually talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration in a lot of detail. And as you can see, it's literally exactly the opposite of photosynthesis. Like the equation is literally, if you flip-flop the sides, you have the same exact equation. Okay, so again, carbon dioxide gets fixed by plants into a usable form, and then it gets released by plants and animals. Decomposers. Carbon is also returned to the atmosphere through decomposers. So as they break down dead material, they return it because decomposers also use oxygen and put out carbon dioxide after they've consumed dead material that has carbon in it. They also break down carbon into like smaller forms so that they can be used again in like fertilizers, or break it down into the soil so that plants can uptake it, because right, all matter is recycled on Earth. There's no new matter being created or destroyed. It's just always recycled. Fossil fuels. There's another way that carbon gets back into the atmosphere, and we have a lot to do with this, we as in humans. So when decaying plants, like dead plants that are like rotting, plants, animals, and waste are trapped underground for millions of years, and they receive a lot of pressure, right? If they're underground and there's a lot of stuff piling on it, it receives a lot of pressure. They could become fossil fuels like oil, gas, and coal, like gasoline when you drive a car, right? That stuff is all fossil fuels. So we fuel a lot of our stuff with fossil fuels. Like natural gas that heats a lot of homes is also a fossil fuel source. Fossil fuels are burned by cars and other sources, releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. So if you see down here, these factory smokestacks look like they're doing really bad for the environment. And it is true, it is bad. A lot of this stuff that you can see is actually like carbon pieces and ash and stuff, but carbon dioxide you can't actually see. Like for example, it's in the air all around you right now and you can't actually see it because you can see through it. But in here, it's mixed in with these clouds of ash that are being burned. And so it's releasing a lot of carbon dioxide. And, you know, at some point, maybe we won't have enough plants on Earth to, you know, balance out how much is being taken out of the air. And we have too much carbon dioxide in the air. And that's a really bad thing. Burning fossil fuel has led to a 30% increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 150 years. So in the last 150 years, humankind has really contributed to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's a bad thing. Like we all know what global warming and climate change is, and that's like a huge reason that global warming and climate change are even happening. So global warming and climate change are caused by the greenhouse effect. So the massive amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have created a blanket around Earth, trapping in energy and resulting in global warming. So we call this the greenhouse effect because when you grow things in a greenhouse, even if it's like the winter, any sunlight that shines into the greenhouse, the heat and energy gets trapped inside of the little structure, and it keeps it warm inside so that plants can grow year round, even when it's cold outside. And that's the same thing happening to the Earth right now, except we don't want the heat trapped in and we don't want the energy trapped in, but it's happening anyway. So our temperatures are rising. Polar ice caps are melting, animals are starving, dying polar bears can't hunt, seals don't have a place to mate. It's pretty bad. Water levels are rising. Florida might be underwater in like the next 100 or so years because the Earth keeps heating up. So the greenhouse effect, this is a diagram showing it. So the sun energy comes in to the atmosphere of the Earth, and plants are using it, right? We can feel it because it gets warm. When we're close to the sun, it's warmer. When we're further away from the sun, it's colder. Some sunlight hits the Earth and is reflected. Some becomes heat, right? Usually a lot of it is reflected because that's just how it works, right? A lot of it's also reflected by our atmosphere. Like the gases in the atmosphere reflect it. Like the The reason why the sky is blue is because of these particles in our atmosphere. And the only reason that you can see it's blue is because the sunlight is bouncing off of those particles. Over here it says carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere trap the heat. So you see this atmosphere right here? There's this thick layer on the outside that's actually made up of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases like carbon monoxide, which also comes from burning fossil fuels and then also from cow farts. So farming is really bad because we farm a lot of cows. And cows, when they fart, they produce carbon monoxide, which is 1, toxic, and 2, a greenhouse gas. So if the heat gets trapped in, it can't bounce out anymore like it's supposed to go, right? It's supposed to go out like this arrow, but it stays trapped in. And as it stays trapped in, it slowly warms up the earth, even the places that aren't supposed to be warm, and that's a bad thing. So again, different processes cause carbon to move, right? We talked about photosynthesis, where it's being taken out of the air. We talked about cellular respiration, where it's being put back into the air. We talked about when it's stored as a fossil fuel deep underground, but we humans dig it out and burn it, so it's releasing it into the air at a higher rate than it naturally would from just respiration, right? So there are a lot of processes that are moving it around, and it's kind of crazy if you think about all of them together because mankind has a huge impact on it. So the next cycle we're talking about is the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is nearly 80% of the Earth's atmosphere. So again, you can't see it. It's in the air that you're actually looking through right now to watch this video from your eyeballs to the screen, but you can't see it, right? Most of the air that we have is nitrogen. If you open up a chip bag, the reason why a lot of it is air is because it's pure nitrogen. So it's not just normal air, it's pure nitrogen. Because if you open a chip bag to like the regular air and you close it for a while and you go back and try to eat it again, the chips go stale because there's water inside of the air. And you can't see it, but the reason they use pure nitrogen is so that chips don't go stale and you can store it for a long time. So it's not really a gimmick that there's air in there, but sometimes, you know, some chip brands be putting too much air. So in the atmosphere, it's in the form of N2, right? So most of our air is actually not oxygen, it's mostly nitrogen. There's some of it that's oxygen, and the other percent includes like greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. And just like having this 1% increase over time slowly is really bad and detrimental to our future prospects of Earth being a livable place. So ammonia is one form of nitrogen that we find a lot in living life forms. So plants and animals can't actually use N2, like the air, the gas form. You breathe it in, you breathe it straight back out. You don't actually use it, unfortunately, because we can't break it down. So we, living creatures, require a different form of nitrogen called ammonia, or the chemical form is NH3. Now, ammonia is closely related to ammonium, which makes your pee smell bad. Okay. So ammonia is shown here, right? You see the NH3, so there's 1 nitrogen and 3 hydrogens attached to the nitrogen. And the reason why it's in the nitrogen cycle is because it has a nitrogen atom in here. So nitrogen fixation, how do we get it from not being usable in the air to us being able to use it? That's a process called nitrogen fixation. It's called fixing, not because it's broken, but because you're changing it into a form that it's useful. Right? When you fix something, it becomes useful to you. So to change the nitrogen from unusable N2 to usable NH3, bacteria and cyanobacteria. Now, cyano means it's blue-green bacteria. Cyan means blue, right? There's a crayon, like Crayola crayon, that's actually called cyan. It's a really pretty, like almost teal blue. So cyano is green-blue bacteria. They fix or they change the nitrogen to be usable from the air in a process called nitrogen fixation. And once they change it from N2 to NH3, then life forms can use it. Nitrogen fixing bacteria. Sometimes these bacteria live in anaerobic or no oxygen areas. So if there's no oxygen and they get exposed to oxygen, they can die right away because they prefer the no oxygen area, okay? So in order to survive in places that even there might be oxygen, they live in little capsules and roots of certain plants. And it's a good partnership, right? It's a symbiotic relationship. Because the plant provides them a house, they can survive. And since they're surviving, they're turning N2 into NH3 for the plants to use. So the plant gets like super fertilizer basically, and it grows really well. So it's a symbiotic relationship where both of them benefit. So you tell me, what is that? Right, it's mutualism, okay? So in the nodules of these plant roots, these bacteria can live without encountering oxygen, and then they can produce NH3 from the NH2 in the air, and then they can like put it into the soil. So not only is this individual plant benefiting, but the extra gets left in the soil. And then when you have other plants that grow there, they also get the benefit of the NH3 or ammonia in that soil. There's a good use of this. So farmers, a lot of the time before fertilizers were really common, there was a natural way to provide fertilizer by using something like this. And that was growing peanuts. So peanut plants have nodules that contain these bacteria that help fertilize the dirt by taking N2 in the air to turn it into NH3 and putting it and leaving it in the dirt. So when you grow corn and you grow wheat and you grow like, I don't know, grapes, those things are all just taking NH3, but they don't make any because they don't have partnerships in their roots, in their nodules. So when when farmers have like 3 fields, they'll have one that grows peanuts, and then they'll have 1 or 2 that grow like corn or wheat or whatever. And then every year they'll rotate them to make sure that every 3rd year the field gets peanuts grown on it so that it gets nitrogen put back into it, into the dirt, so that the dirt is nutritious for plants to grow on. Otherwise, if you kept growing just wheat and corn on the same fields, then all the nitrogen in the ammonia form gets used up, and then the plants don't really grow well anymore. There's no nutrition, right? Then you have bad crops, and then you lose money because you spend so much planting them, but you're not getting any back because they're not growing well, right? So they used to rotate crops with plants like peanuts. And you can also just sell peanuts and make peanut oil with it. So it's super useful. It's not like you're just growing it just to do fertilizer. So how do animals get nitrogen? Same way that we get carbon, right? Animals get nitrogen from eating plants or other animals, right? If you eat another animal, that animal has nitrogen in it. So you're gonna eat it and then use that nitrogen. If you eat a plant, remember the plant is the one that originally pulled the nitrogen directly from the soil that the bacteria helped, convert. So that also provides nitrogen. Basically, a lot of stuff directly goes to plants, and then animals always just eat stuff to get stuff for carbon and nitrogen. So release of nitrogen. When plants and animals die, their decaying or rotting bodies release nitrogen back into the soil for plants to use. That's why things like poop and dead animals are great fertilizers, because they are a direct source of containing nitrogen, and they're still in the usable form of NH3 because that's how we intake it, right? That directly goes into the soil, and then plants just pull it up in their roots and just use it. There's also this process of denitrification. So remember, nitrification is like nitrogen fixation. It's when you take the nitrogen and you fix it to be usable. But if you do that process, then you're opposite of that process, right? So there are also bacteria that change ammonia back into nitrogen gas. So they take the NH3 that other bacteria worked hard to change into usable form, and they change it back into gas, and it goes back into the atmosphere. So it's one of the reasons why we always have almost 80% of the air as nitrogen. Like I talked about before, fertilizers help plants grow faster because they contain a large amount of nitrogen. And that's literally the only reason why they make plants grow. Because they do instead of waiting for nitrogen fixation to happen, you can just put free nitrogen into the ground because we can chemically make it, right? But fertilizers aren't exactly the best, because if you have a lot in the farmland, and you water your plants, and the water takes some of the fertilizer because there's so much of it and pulls it and goes into the nearby lakes, creeks, and ponds and stuff, then it causes the plants in the lakes, creeks, and ponds to grow too much. For example, algae. Then you have algae covering the ponds, and then nothing else gets the ability to surface or get oxygen or gets any sunlight at the bottom of the ponds and lakes and creeks. And then you get things dying because there's too much algae, because the algae got the fertilizer. So too much nitrogen in the cycle from human input is a really bad thing, because if you disrupt the natural cycle and you overbalance one side of the scale of putting in and not enough is returning, then other life forms can get killed from it, right? So all the life in the pond nearby a farmland that used too much fertilizer can die off because the algae basically clouds over the whole pond and makes oxygen and light inaccessible for anything else living in that pond. Okay, so plants are capable of A, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere only, B, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere only, both absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, or D, neither absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere nor releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? The answer is C. They do both. Remember, they do photosynthesis, which absorbs carbon dioxide, and they do cellular respiration, which releases carbon dioxide, right? Animals only release. 2, from Earth's atmosphere, carbon dioxide is used by bacteria and cyanobacteria during the process of A, photosynthesis, B, respiration, C, decomposition, or D, nitrogen fixation. The answer is A, right? A is only usable, right? Carbon dioxide is only usable in photosynthesis. It's an input in photosynthesis, right? I know it's kind of tricky because we talked about bacteria and cyanobacteria in the nitrogen cycle, but again, the question asked about carbon dioxide specifically. Number 3, which of the following processes releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? A, photosynthesis, B, ocean uptake, C, proliferation, or D, respiration? The answer is D, respiration, right? We're talking about releasing. The other processes are more related to intaking and absorbing. 4, plants are considered a source in the carbon cycle when they A, take in carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere and use energy from the sun to convert it into their food. B, release carbon dioxide gas as a waste during the process of respiration. C, are ingested by animals during the food chain or die and decompose, bringing carbon into the soil and atmosphere. Or D, both B and C. The answer is both B and C. 5, without bacteria, the nitrogen cycle would run exactly the same, would run much more quickly, would come almost to a complete halt, or would be unpredictable. And the answer is C, because if you don't have bacteria, you can't fix the nitrogen to a usable ammonia form. You also can't return it to the atmosphere, so the cycle literally will stop. C, carbon in the atmosphere is most often found as the compound A, stratospheric ozone, B, fossil fuel, C, carbon monoxide, or D, carbon dioxide. The answer is D, carbon dioxide, right? Ozone is actually just oxygen. It's O3. Fossil fuels are not a gas in the atmosphere. Carbon monoxide is in the atmosphere, but there's not a lot of it, because if there was a lot of it, we would all be dying of carbon monoxide poisoning. So carbon dioxide is the answer. With that being said, please make sure that you now go on to your interactive journal, finish up section 1, and then do your exit ticket.